Good afternoon. I'm Dan McClellan from successnc.org, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Performance-Based Funding for North Carolina Community Colleges. This webinar is brought to you by North Carolina Community Colleges and successnc.org. And in just a moment, I'll turn it over to our panelists, and we'll begin the presentation. Throughout today's presentation, we do want to hear from you, so please type your questions and comments in the chat box located on the right side of the screen. I'll be watching the chat box and capturing all of your questions, and we've scheduled some time today to address all of your questions. And be sure to send your questions to all participants. Once again, thank you for being here, and at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Sharon Morrissey.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure for me to welcome all of you to today's Success NC webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information to Chief Academic Officers and Student Development Administrators on a proposed model for performance-based funding in the North Carolina Community College system. Those of you who have been reading the research and following legislative trends in other states know that tying funding to accountability outcomes is a growing trend across publicly funded institutions of higher education in the United States. Last year, the General Assembly directed the State Board of Community Colleges to develop a plan to merge our performance standards and measures into the regular funding formula that is used to allocate funds to community colleges. Our State Board has worked closely with our President's Association to develop a performance funding model that is intended to help our colleges and our system meet the student success outcomes that were established as part of our Success NC Strategic Planning Initiative. So the proposed model that you will hear about today recognizes student progress and completion, values progress and continuous improvement, and rewards programs for quality and impact on the state's workforce. This performance-based funding model is currently under final review by the President's Association and the State Board of Community Colleges. If it is adopted by the State Board in February, the model will be presented to the Joint Legislative Education Oversight Committee on March 1st. The presenters for today's webinar are Bill Schneider, Associate Vice President for Research and Performance Management, who will review the development of the new performance measures, and Jennifer Haygood, Executive Vice President for Operations and Chief Finance Officer, who will describe the funding model. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Success NC website. And now Mr. Bill Schneider will begin the webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Morrissey. I thought it would probably be a good idea to start this presentation by giving you a little bit of background of where we've been with performance measures and associated performance funding. Really, for the state of North Carolina Community College system, performance measures actually started back in the late 1980s. These were referred to as critical success factors, and they're really established at the beginning for system-wide performance. And then we had a transition in the early 90s from system-level assessment to more at the college-level performance. In the late 90s, we were directed by the General Assembly to study performance-based funding, and in the early 2000s, performance funding was implemented and tied to performance standards. Since then, performance measures and their standards have slightly been modified, but the performance funding model has remained fairly consistent. In 2010, the system started its Success NC initiative, and part of that initiative was to develop performance-based student success measures. In 2010, we launched a new Performance Measures Committee. This committee was led by President Dennis Massey from Pitt Community College and President Molly Parkhill from Blue Ridge. And the group was very representative of presidents, vice presidents, deans, institutes of research across the state. And while the group was working on developing these performance measures, we reached out to various stakeholders across the state for their input. In April 2011, a statewide survey went out to various stakeholders getting their input on a new draft of performance measures. In June 2011, At Dr. Rawls' request, we added an intermediate measure of first-year progression. And from August through 2011, multiple presentations were made to stakeholder associations, including faculty, chief academic officers, presidents, and institutional researchers and state board. In October 2011, the state board formally approved the performance measures. In November 2011, the performance measures were reviewed and methodologies associated with those measures were drafted by institutional researchers across the state. In March of 2012, these measures were submitted to the legislature, and in June 2012, the General Assembly adopted the revised measures. And also in June 2012, the last critical success factors report utilizing the old performance measures was released. So in the end, we came up with 8 performance measures. As you can see, a lot of these look familiar. It includes progress of basic skills students, performance of college transfer students, passing rates of licensure and certification exams, developmental student success rate in subsequent credit English courses, the same success rate in math courses, curriculum student progress, curriculum student persistence and completion, and a new one dealing with GED completion. This next slide kind of shows you our evolution. And starting with the progress-based skills, you can see that is consistent from the past list of measures to the current list. The same goes for transfer students, licensure certification exams. You can see that if you look at the middle of the screen, success rate developmental students in subsequent level college courses was split into English and math. And there was 2 measures that now deal with student progression and student completion, which we kind of combined before in one measure. And we have eliminated 3 measures. One included the passing rates of students in developmental courses. Another was client satisfaction with customized training. And a third was student satisfaction of program completers and non-completers. Next, I'll go through the various measures and their descriptions and kind of just provide some guidance as far as how the measures have changed since the last list of measures. So as I go through these, you can see the names and the measures are fairly consistent, but the descriptions have changed substantially. For example, the first measure we have here is developmental student success in college-level English courses. The old measure looked at the percentage of students who got A through D divided by students who had A through F and subsequent courses. The committee felt it was important that we define success as a C or better, and also that we include withdrawals in our denominator. So as we move forward, our new success measure is going to be percentage of students who receive a C or better in a subsequent English course divided by, for the most part, all the students that attempted that course. This is consistent with the measure below, which looks at development student success rate in college-level math courses. And on the next slide, we're looking at first-year progression. This is the measure that I mentioned that Dr. Rawls requested that we have. Is a measure that looks at academic momentum point that helps predict future credential completion. And here we're looking at what we felt was a momentum point based on research was the success of 12 credit hours. So we're looking at of students who attempt at least 12 credit hours in their first academic year, what percentage complete at least 12 hours. This includes students who attempt 18 hours. As long as they met that 12-hour threshold, it would be considered a success. The next measure is looking at curriculum completion. This is looking at a cohort of students and looking at their 6-year success rate. So we're looking at a percentage of first-time fall credential-seeking students who graduate, transfer, or are still enrolled with 36 hours after 6 years. So for instance, when we're looking at this upcoming performance measure, we'll be looking back at the 2006 cohort and looking at their success rate by 2012. Probably the most consistent one we have with our old measures is licensure certification passing rate. The biggest difference with this measure compared to the way we used to do it is we no longer look at individual licensing exam. It is an aggregate of all of your exams across the state for this measure. We've also included, we're going to add about 4 new exams to this measure, and we'll provide more information on those forthcoming. The next measure is college transfer performance. Previously, we had looked at 24 or more credit hours as a threshold of whether or not we're going to assess a student's success at the 4-year institution. We decided to move that threshold up to 30 hours because we felt that that would be a better measure of students actually taking our articulated credits at our college level for the university. And the last 2 measures here, one dealing with basic skills student progress and GED diploma passing rate. The GED diploma passing rate is a new measure. Right now, we're working to refine the methodology associated with these measures, and we're hopefully we'll be pushing that for state board approval probably this upcoming spring. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Morrissey to field any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Bill. And at this time, no one has typed in a question, and I want to remind everyone that if you do have a question you would like to pose, you can key in and hit send, and we will be happy to answer any questions you might have. So Bill has just gone through the new performance measures that have been adopted by the State Board of Community Colleges, and also they have been adopted by the General Assembly. They are now part of state law. So if you have any questions about the methodologies that Bill described or any of these new performance measures, this would be the time, your opportunity to ask a question. So let's go on now to look at the funding portion of today's webinar, which will be presented by Jennifer Haygood.
Good afternoon. This is Jennifer Haygood. I'll be going over our proposed performance-based funding model, which is definitely a new approach to performance-based funding. I think it's really important for everyone who is familiar with our existing performance-based funding model to sort of move out of your mind our historic model, which has been based on carry-forward funds, and think of this as a new approach where performance is embedded in our formula funding. I'll come back to that on a couple of occasions this afternoon, but want to make sure that we're thinking this is a whole new approach to how performance and our funding are linked. To pick up where Bill left off, we talked about how the revised performance measures were adopted by the State Board, and those performance measures were presented to the General Assembly. Those were adopted last summer. Simultaneously, last spring, the Performance Funding Committee was launched. This committee has been led by Chairman K. Ray Bailey, who is former president of AB Tech and currently serves as the Finance and Capital Needs Committee Chair of the State Board, and President Garrett Henshaw, president of CVCC. The Performance Funding Committee includes a number of presidents from all types of colleges, representing the breadth and depth of our colleges across the state. That committee has met on a virtually monthly basis since April to discuss various performance funding models, looking at research that's been done nationwide, and to develop the model that we're going to discuss today. This model was presented to the President's Association in October, and at that time, the President's Association did vote to endorse the direction of the funding model. It was also presented in October to our State Board, the Business Officers Association, and CC Pro. So if you are a member of one of those organizations and had seen a presentation about the model previously, you're going to hear pretty much very similar things today, as the model has not substantively changed since October. The Performance Funding Committee has met since October, but has pretty much just refined some minor points, but has kept consistent with the core of the proposal. A couple other key milestones that I would note is, as Dr. Morrissey noted earlier today, this proposal will be going to our state board this month for future action, to the President's Association later this month for action, and then back to our state board ultimately for action in February. Assuming the state board does endorse this model, we would anticipate that we would report later in February, no later than March 1st, a report capturing the principles and concepts of the model that we're going to discuss. Before I start talking about the details of the model, however, I really want to focus on guiding principles. It was very important to the Performance-Based Funding Committee to first develop a set of guiding principles to ensure that what was being developed was driven by the conceptual underpinnings of what we were trying to achieve. A lot of effort was taken at the first couple of meetings to nail down these key principles, which include rewarding both student progress and completion. I would note that by virtue of the measures that have been adopted, that progress and completion are indeed rewarded. Developing a performance-based funding system that would incentivize colleges in ways that is not exclusive and provides opportunities to all colleges to benefit. Previously, I discussed about how this would be a model where performance is being embedded in the formula, the method by which we allocate funds to colleges for the general operations. As a result, it was particularly important to the committee that all colleges had the opportunity to benefit, and that it was a very inclusive model. Likewise, they wanted to ensure that the model did not incentivize colleges in a way that provided for a winner-take-all system. Those of you who are familiar with our existing system and are familiar with the exceptional pool of colleges understand how this guiding principle may be in reaction to our existing model. Colleges did not want to develop a model where certain colleges or a certain select group of colleges seemed to perhaps get a windfall or an outsized reward from the model. They also wanted to make sure that the model accommodated the fact that colleges are different. While we share a common mission, certain colleges may emphasize college transfer, other colleges may emphasize career and technical education programs, and wanted the model to be able to adjust appropriately. Another key guiding principle was that we wanted a model that incentivized colleges to value progress and improvement. This is another guiding principle that I think is in direct reaction to our existing performance funding model, where it's sort of an all or nothing. You either meet the standard or you don't. If you meet the standard, you get the reward, which currently is to be able to carry forward funds. If you don't meet the standard, you don't get anything. The committee decided that they wanted a more graduated approach, an approach that valued progress and continuous improvement. Finally, they wanted to incentivize colleges in a way that rewards both program quality but also program impact. Obviously, if we are improving quality or if presenting our programs as high quality because a high percentage of students succeed on measures, but we're doing that by restricting access and limiting the number of students that we actually have succeed on the measures, that is counter to our mission, counter to our commitment to access, and counter to our state's workforce needs. So the committee really valued a model that looked at both quality and impact. Because there has been, at times, lots of questions about our current program and current performance funding model, it was also important that the model be implemented in a way that was predictable, gradual, transparent, and as simplistic as possible. The committee felt like it was very important that we have broad buy-in into the model, and buy-in can be gained if people can actually understand how the model works and feels like the model allocates funds or rewards colleges objectively and in a fair manner. Hence the reason for that particular guiding principle. And finally, be supported with new recurring funds. We are all very much aware of the impact that management flex cuts and other cuts have taken to our colleges over the last few years. Indeed, if you look since the recession, our per-student state-funded expenditures, meaning those expenditures that are supported with state general fund appropriations, has declined by 20% since 2007-8. We are arguing strenuously with the General Assembly that we would like this and feel that it's very important that this performance funding model be supported with new recurring funds, that colleges are going to need additional funds to implement the student success strategies and to change way of business so that we can move the dial, move the needle on student success, and that those new recurring funds are essential to success. So with those guiding principles in mind, we'll jump in to the essence of the recommendation, which is over a multi-year period, the goal is to have $30 million in new recurring funds to allocate on a two-pronged basis, rewarding quality, which would allocate funds based on a percentage of students who succeed on each measure, and rewarding impact, which would allocate funds based on the number of students who succeed on each measure. Now let me pause there and talk about how did we arrive at $30 million. Obviously, any amount of money has some level of arbitrariness, but in conversations within the system and looking at national research, it was deemed that we felt like approximately 3% of our general fund appropriation, or 3% of the funds that we allocate through colleges, would be an appropriate amount of funding to be based on performance. $30 million reflects approximately that. We're also looking at a goal of having $5 million per performance measure to allocate. Now, we talked about how there's actually 8 measures. The reason that we are focusing on 30 million, which would be 5 million times 6 measures, is because in the short term, we are recommending that basic skills and GED measures initially not be part of the performance-based model as we are refining and validating the data. Also, the rationale is we are currently allocating funds for basic skills on a performance basis through the component of the basic skills block grant formula, which looks at the number of GEDs awarded. We anticipate that once the funds or the data for basic skills and the GED completion measures are refined and are adopted by the state board, that we would use the funds that we are currently allocating in the basic skills block grant based on GED attainment and use those funds to implement this model on these 2 measures. So today, the remainder of the presentation is really going to focus on those other 6 measures, and that's the reason why. So let's take a little bit more in-depth look at what we mean by rewarding quality and rewarding impact. When we look at rewarding quality, again, right now in our performance funding model, it's an all or nothing. You either meet the standard or you don't. You get the same reward if you meet the standard, regardless of whether you barely meet the standard or you exceed the standard significantly. That was not the direction that the Performance Funding Committee is recommending. Rather, when it comes to rewarding quality, we want to look at college performance in context of how a college compares to both a baseline and a goal. What you see on this slide is graphically an example of this in concept. We would look at whether a college met the baseline. If it didn't meet the baseline, then a college would receive no performance-based funding through the quality component. If, however, a college exceeded the baseline but didn't meet the goal, it would receive a portion of the funds that is eligible to receive. If it met the goal, it would get 100% of the funds it was eligible to receive. And if it exceeded the goal, a college would actually receive more than 100% of the funds that they are eligible to receive. So you can see conceptually what we're trying to achieve is to ensure that there is a certain baseline level or expectation of performance, but that colleges have the opportunity to benefit even if they weren't necessarily meeting the absolute goal, but also to ensure that there is ample motivation and a reward for continuous improvement, regardless of whether you even have met the goal. Therefore, we want to reward colleges if they exceed the goal. Obviously, the first key question is to figure out what would be our baseline and goals. The committee discussed various options for how to set baseline and goals, but ultimately decided that it would go on a basis of looking at historical data and coming up with the baseline and goals on a statistical basis. Initially, the baseline for each measure would be set at 2 standard deviations below the system mean, based on up to 3 years of data if available. What you'll see on this slide is based on the data that we have for multiple years. You will see for each of those measures what the system mean, the standard deviation, and as a result, what those baselines would be. It was important to the committee, again, to make sure that this model was as simplistic as possible. Hence, you will see that the baseline and the goals are being set on the same basis across all 6 measures. That is because we wanted to make it simplistic and consistent across the measures. The goal would initially be set at 1 standard deviation above the system mean. You'll see at the bottom of the last row of the graph what those goals would be. The baseline and goals would remain the same for 3 years and then reset. The committee felt like it was important that obviously there would be continuous review and adjustment to the goals. However, at the same time, that it was important for colleges to know from the outset what their target was and what they were shooting for. Hence the reason why the goals would be set ahead of time and would stay static for 3 years, giving colleges the opportunity to stay focused on the target, and then after every 3 years reset those goals. If we look at performance data from 2009-10, which is the most recent data for which we have available, you can see the distribution among colleges for each of the 6 measures. So for instance, for developmental English subsequent success, we'll see that 4 colleges are below 2 standard deviations below the system mean. So, in other words, 4 colleges would not receive any performance funding on the quality component for that particular measure. On other measures, you'll see that either 1 or 2, or in the case of curriculum completion, no colleges are below that baseline. So you'll immediately see that the vast majority of colleges would benefit from the model. All colleges in the red, green, purple, and blue would receive funds through the quality component on these measures. So for instance, for developmental English subsequent success, we would have 4 colleges that did not meet the baseline and therefore would not receive any performance-based funding for quality on that particular measure. 6 colleges would receive 6 plus 21, I'm sorry, it was just 27. And then an additional 20 colleges, so 47 colleges would receive a portion of the funds that they were eligible for, and then 7 colleges would actually receive more than what they would be entitled to if they just met the goal. So you can see from this measure, from this graph, that this is indeed an inclusive model. If we look very specifically at a sample performance measure, we can think about this perhaps a little bit more concretely. So let's think specifically about the licensure exam passing rate measure, one that has stayed relatively constant in the history of performance measures in our system and is widely understood. So if we look at our data system-wide, the baseline for this particular measure is 71%. The goal is 92%. We had 9,148 students who sat for a licensure exam for the first time in 2009-10 and took the test. And in our example, we're going to assume that we have the full $5 million for this measure. Then we're going to think about this by looking at 3 sample colleges, college A, B, and C. The first step is to determine the potential performance-based funding amount that a college would earn. What we mean by potential performance-based funding is the amount of funding that a college would earn if it met the goal. We determine that by looking at the total amount of funding that we have available, which in our example is going to be, we are going to assume $5 million. We look at the total number of students who took the test, i.e. the number of students that are in the denominator of the measure. We divide the two to get the amount of potential performance-based funding a college may get. So if we look at a specific college, we would look at how many students sat for the licensure exam, multiply that by our $546.57, and that would determine how much money a college would be eligible for. This is an important point for how we arrive at a college's potential quality allocation, because if you are going to increase your percentage of students who succeed on the measure, i.e., in our example, if you're going to increase the percentage of students who pass the licensure exam simply by restricting the number of students who actually sit for the exam, obviously your potential performance-based funding amount would be smaller. This is a mechanism to ensure or disincentivize creaming or restricting access of students into the programs. So if we look specifically at our sample college, again, we had system-wide just over 9,148 students who took the exam. We're going to assume we have $5 million available to allocate, which would mean that a college would have the potential performance-based funding per student of $546.57 for this particular measure. Looking at college A, they had 175 students take the test. Again, we take 175, multiply that by our potential performance-based funding amount per student to get $95,649. So let's pause right there and remember, what does that mean? What that means is that for college A, if they met the goal, they would be allocated $95,649 through the quality component of this measure. Let me say that one more time. What potential performance-based funding means is the amount of money that a college could earn if it met the goal for that measure, okay? So again, we can think about our 3 sample colleges. College A, they are below the baseline. So as we discussed previously, they would not receive any quality performance-based funding for this particular measure. College B, they are performing between the baseline and the goal, meaning they have the percentage of their students who are passing the licensure exam on the first try is above the baseline but below the goal, and therefore they're only going to get a percentage. Roughly, we can see here from the graph, a little bit over 50%. Then we have College C. College C's performance is actually exceeding the goal of 91%. So they're going to get more than their potential performance-based funding amount. If we look at the actual calculations, this table shows you the specific math. Again, we look at the percentage of students who are passing the licensure exams. We look at how that performance compares to both the baseline and the goal to determine what percentage of your potential performance-based funding you would receive. To put those pieces together, we determined how much a college would be eligible for if they met the goal. Then we determined what percentage the college would actually receive based on their performance. Multiply those two numbers together, and that's how you arrive at what the college's quality allocation would be for this particular measure. So the steps that we went through right here, we were doing based on the licensure exam passing rate measure. If this model was implemented, we would go through the same steps for each of the 6 measures and then ultimately all 8 measures. Let's pause now to check to see how that potential quality component compares to some of our guiding principles. You may recall that we said that one of the guiding principles was that the model not be exclusive and provides opportunities for all colleges to benefit. We saw from the distribution that the vast majority of colleges would receive some funds through the quality component for each measure. While there are some colleges that may not receive it for an individual measure, no college fails to meet the baseline across all 6 measures. Also, we didn't want a model that provided a winner-take-all system. Again, the graduated approach that looks at college performance in comparison to both a baseline and a goal prohibits or ensures that we don't have a winner-take-all system. The fact that the amount of money that a college may earn through a particular measure depends on the number of students who are actually being measured accommodates the fact that different colleges may have different programmatic emphases. Obviously, if you're a college that has a number of programs that prepare students for taking licensure exams, you would have more students who will be included in that measure and therefore would have the potential of earning more funds through that measure. The graduated approach, again, supports the guiding principle of valuing progress and improvement. And this whole conversation about this particular component talks about rewarding quality. Obviously, this particular component speaks only to impact in the sense of your potential performance-based funding is determined based on the number of students who actually sit, but we're going to talk more about impact and how that might be included in the model in the next component. So clearly from the first quality component, not all colleges are going to receive the amount of money for which they are eligible for because not everyone is meeting the goal. Indeed, when we did the analysis based on 2009-10 performance, we find that approximately 66% of the funds are allocated through the quality component of this model. 33% of the funds then remain available for allocation. Those funds will be allocated through the second component that focuses on impact. Now, just to make sure we are all on the same page, how is it that we have funds that are not allocated? Those are the funds that are for colleges who did not meet the baseline and therefore none of their potential performance-based funding was allocated, and those colleges who failed to meet the goal. Obviously, a portion of the funds that are not allocated to colleges in those 2 categories are used to help support those colleges that are exceeding the goal. However, there still remains, based on 2009-10 data, about a third of the funds that will be allocated through the rewarding impact component. This component is focused on looking at the number of students that succeed on each measure. So while the quality component is focused on the rate or the percentage of students that succeed on the measure, the impact component is focused on the number of students that succeed on each measure. Basically, how this component will work is we look at how much funding is available for the impact component, which is based on the total funding that was available minus how much was allocated through the quality component. We determine how many students succeeded on the measure across the system. We divide those 2 numbers to determine the impact funding per student. And then we determine a college's impact allocation by taking that number and multiplying it by the number of students who are successful on the measure. Now that was a mouthful, so let's turn to the next slide and think about this on a more concrete basis. In our example, we had assumed that we had $5 million to allocate for the licensure exam performance measure. We also determined that through the quality component that about $3.8 million of that would be allocated based on college's performance as it relates to the baseline and the goal, leaving approximately $1.2 million still available for allocation. When we look system-wide, we see that 7,952 students succeeded by passing the licensure certification exam on their first try. So if we take the $1.2 million that's available, divide that by the just under 8,000 students who succeeded on the measure, we see that the impact funding per student, or the amount of funds that would be allocated to a college for each student that passed the licensure certification exam, would be just over $150. So come down here, look at College A. They had 131 students who passed the test. They will get 131 times 152, or $19,962. You may recall that College A was an institution that was not meeting the baseline, and therefore they did not receive any funding on this measure through the quality component. That, however, does not prevent them from receiving performance funding through the impact component. As long as a college has students succeeding on the measure, they would receive funding through this component. Obviously, the math works the same with the other colleges, looking specifically at the number of students passing or succeeding on that measure. So putting the two components together, we start out looking at our potential performance-based funding. We have $5 million available for allocation. We go through the math to determine how much a college could receive if they met the goal. We look at their performance in relation to both the baseline and the goal to determine the percentage of performance-based funding for quality that they would earn. Multiply those two numbers to get what their quality allocation would be for that measure. We see that system-wide performance 2009-10 performance data suggests that just under $3.8 million would be allocated through this component, which would leave $1.2 million for allocation through the impact component. Again, we look at how many students succeed on the measure, determine how much per student would be eligible to be allocated for each successful student, and that is how we determine the individual college's impact allocation. The combination of the quality allocation and the impact allocation would be the amount of money that a college would be funded for this particular measure. So the calculations that we just walked through for licensure exam would be repeated for the other 5 measures next year, and ultimately for all 8 measures in the future. We've already discussed how this model speaks to many of these guiding principles, and with this last component, we really address both the quality and the impact component. Now, I'm sure that many of you have some questions, but a few other things that I would note is that these funds would be allocated as part of formula funding. They would be part of the regular budget package that colleges would receive, and therefore would have all the characteristics and flexibility that a college has when it comes to formula funds. These performance funds would be treated just like any other formula dollars, and therefore would be able to be used very flexibly. They would not be limited to very specific non-recurring items as has been the case in the past. So in that, I see that we've got some questions, and Dr. Morrissey, you want to throw it over to you to take us through the questions?
Be happy to, and I want to say thank you to Jennifer and Bill for this excellent overview of the proposed performance-based funding model. And I also want to just take a moment to recognize the work of the committee members and of Jennifer and Bill, who provided staff assistance to the committee as they worked through all of the iterations of this and looked at all of the possibilities. I think the proposed funding model that's before us today is very logical. It accomplishes the goals that we've set for the North Carolina Community College system. It allows us to ask the legislature for new money to replace perhaps some of the funds that were cut during the recession years, so perhaps a way to rebuild our financial base and to tie those funds to performance of our students. We do have several questions to go through, and I think the first couple of questions are pretty interesting regarding summer funding. So, Bill, I'm going to ask you if question number 2 particularly makes the person makes the note that we don't receive summer funding. If former students complete their English and their maths during the summer, are those students still eligible to be counted for performance funding?
So if this is looking at the success rate of students who previously taken developmental courses, they would be. I believe it's either a 1 or a 2-year time frame in which they take their credit level in order to be counted for the measure. So they would be counted in the denominator for that measure.
Good. As we look on through the questions, the third question sort of relates to this, again, the summer issue. What about if we look at the first-year progression? Are we just looking at fall and spring, or are we going to include students who start in the summer?
We're going with the cohort tracking model, so we are focusing on the fall cohorts. So it would only be the fall credential-seeking students. So students starting in spring or summer would not be counted for this performance measure.
Good. Okay, and they would not be counted negatively either.
That's correct.
Okay, because it is cohort-based.
Right.
We always have questions about on the licensure and passing rates. We always have questions about what happens with colleges who have small numbers of students. Someone made the point that if a college has 16 students who transfer and one student could do poorly, which would cause that student to miss the goal, will there be any adjustments made for small numbers of students in these cohorts?
Right now our plans are not to adjust. Probably what you'll see is that there's a small N issue, which is for us is usually less than 5, or in some measures less than 10, but we would not report on those students for our reports that go out to the public and to the schools. However, they would be included in the performance model that Jennifer presented.
Okay, good.
So in other words, the colleges would receive funding based on the percentage of students who succeed and the number of students who succeed.
Good. And I think you just answered question number 5 as well, which is, are all test takers counted, or do you not count the ones for if a college has less than 10 or fewer than 5 or fewer than 10 students? And you indicated that those students would not be counted in published reports, but they would be counted in terms of the funding model.
Right. And just piggybacking on the licensure exams, we really should not have a small N issue anymore since we are aggregating all the exams and we're not looking at each individual exam specifically. Excellent.
Good. The next question is about, was there any consideration given to doing away with first-time test takers and looking instead at students who pass a licensure exam within a year of completing the program or completing the training? And this is something that I wish we could do. However, our other agencies who collect this data about licensure and report the data back to us, such as the Board of Nursing, they do not have a way yet of identifying who's a first-time test taker or a third-time test taker. so until our partner agencies can provide us with that information, we cannot change the way that measure looks. We know, I think I misstated, we know who the first-time test takers are, but then they don't, these agencies don't track the students for multiple test-taking times, so we can't track a student to see if they didn't pass the first time and they passed the third time, can we count them as a success? Let's go on to the next set of questions. A couple of questions here about GED. Will adult high school programs be funded the same way as funding for GED graduates?
It was decided when we looked at our performance measures that we would exclude adult high school and just focus on the GED graduates. And if I remember correctly, the rationale behind it was that not all colleges provide adult high school diplomas. This is one that we've talked about internally here that might be up for consideration as we move forward when we review our measures in 3 years.
Okay. The students, this is looking at the measures for developmental student success in subsequent courses, and it is correct that students who withdraw would be included in the denominator. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And the next question is about evaluating colleges on this academic year, even though the basic skills performance measures have not been approved to date. Will you speak to how we're addressing the basic skills performance for this year?
Sure. Hopefully in the next couple of months we will have some approved measures and approved methodologies associated with that. So even though there's no performance funding allocation to that, I still plan to include the percentages in the performance measure report that should be coming out this summer. So even though there's not that money tied to it, the colleges will be identified, based on their performance.
And I believe we also have some in our basic skills area. We need to do validation of some of the data that we have received. Is that correct? That's correct, and that's one of the things we're struggling with right now is really the past year we've done a lot of work through our basic skills focus area team within the data initiative, really clean up some of our processes, doing a better job of defining our various data elements within the data system. So I think where we're sitting at right now is that we're feeling pretty good about 2010-11 data as being like a baseline year, and then potentially 11-12 as kind of being our first production year as far as assessing colleges. Excellent. And the next question refers to the fact that baselines and goals, you mentioned that you use 3 years of historical data to set the baselines and goals for the funding measures. Since we're changing from the traditional developmental education to the new developmental math this fall and then developmental reading and English next fall, will we be revisiting those measures to establish new baselines and goals?
Really, for these measures, it doesn't really matter how the courses are delivered at the developmental level, because what we'll be doing is we'll be looking back at students who took a developmental course, whether it was modularized, whether it's traditional, it doesn't matter. So I really don't see, hopefully what we'll see as we move forward with these modules, we'll see our statewide percentages go up, and probably in 3 years you'll see a substantial change in our goal for those measures.
Okay, let's hope so. And Jennifer, I think this is a question for you. What happens if we do not receive funding for performance measures and then recurring funding once the performance measures and the performance-based funding model is in place?
That's a very good question. What we discussed today is a proposal. It is a proposal that will go to the General Assembly and a proposal that was developed at their directive. Clearly, what will happen will depend on what the General Assembly directs us to do. We will be arguing vehemently about the fact that we need recurring funding to support this model. I think we will be also talking about that in the context of the fact that some of our schools are experiencing a slight decline in enrollment, and therefore we would like to retain the funds that would otherwise be reduced from our budget because of that enrollment decline to help support and reinvest into this particular model. We will be working very hard to receive recurring funds. Obviously, there are two options if we don't receive recurring funds. One is the General Assembly takes no action. If the General Assembly took no action, either by telling us to implement the plan nor funds, then I would anticipate the State Board would do nothing until we could revisit that with the General Assembly. There's always the risk that the General Assembly will tell us to do it without providing new recurring funds. That is a reality. We hope that we do not reach that place. If we did not put forth a proposal, I can guarantee, however, that the General Assembly will come up with their own way of embedding performance in our funding formula, and therefore this is our best effort to get out ahead of that conversation and provide them a plan that we feel like is well thought out before they come up with their own plan.
And I think that's a very important point, because I think this is a very well thought out, deliberate, logical plan, and someone asked the question, do we know how receptive the legislature will be to both to this plan and to the request for increased funding? Do you have any idea, Jennifer?
We are hopeful, particularly since we have the initial feedback that we've received from the community college family has been pretty receptive to this model. We're hopeful by the fact that if we have broad support within our system, that will play favorably into the General Assembly's consideration of our request. Truthfully, at this point in time, it really is too early in the process to have a good prediction about this. I feel like that we are taking proactive and good faith efforts to respond to their desire for greater accountability, and hope that we are rewarded accordingly. But because we have a new governor and new executive administration in town, and by the fact that we have, I believe, a General Assembly that 60% of the members are either freshmen or sophomores, we have folks who are going to need a lot of education on this issue, and because they are so new to both our system and to the state as a whole, it really is too early to give any good predictions at this time.
Well, we will trust that our presidents and that you and other staff members who work with the legislature very closely will carry the message for us. We have two other questions, I think, that have not been answered yet. One is, again, Jennifer, for you, what happens to the proportion of funds for each performance measure in which all colleges don't meet the goal? Now, I'm assuming that if colleges...
If I'm interpreting this question properly, obviously, if more colleges don't meet the goal, that would mean that there would be less funds allocated through the quality component, which would then in turn mean that those funds would be allocated through the impact component. So maybe another way of looking at it is the higher the college performance on the quality measure will result in less money available for the impact component, and vice versa. If performance is lower on average, then less money will be allocated through the quality component and more will be allocated through the impact component.
Correct.
But I do want to make sure it's clear that in all scenarios, all funds would be allocated between those two components. There would not be any funds that would remain unallocated. Another question that didn't come up, but I would want to clarify is, in our example, we were assuming $5 million. Obviously, that was the amount of money that we would like to receive for each goal after a multi-year period. If we receive less money then what would happen is whatever money is available for performance-based funding would be equally distributed among the 6 measures. So
very good.
Only $10 million or $15 million was allocated, then we would be looking at $2.5 million available for each measure rather than 5.
Good. So all the money will be allocated, none will be left on the table, and thank you for that wonderful explanation. And the last question, I believe, Jennifer, earlier last week you sent a report to the presidents for performance outcomes for 2010-2011, and the question is this information available to be shared with faculty and staff at this time? I have not sent that out yet to the chief academic officers or student development administrators, and I'm not sure if it was sent out as preliminary review or if it is a final report.
Sharon, or Dr. Morris, this is Bill, and I would recommend that the college kind of hold off on wide distribution right now. We will be providing a more detailed report in early February with more context to it. So it might be a good idea for the president to kind of hold on to that, or maybe share with their immediate staff, but the report that's more for wide distribution will be forthcoming in February.
Okay, good. So we'll make sure to get that out to everybody when the final report is ready for distribution. That is all of the questions that I see on the screen right now. Again, I want to thank Jennifer Haygood and Bill Schneider for participating in this presentation this afternoon. I thought that it was especially important for the chief academic officers and student development administrators to understand the performance-based funding model that is being proposed and talked about. I also want to thank, again, recognize the members of the committee, well, both committees, both the Performance Standards and Measures Committee and the Performance-Based Funding Committee. These committees have worked long and hard for a couple of years, and they've done a super job, and I'm really pleased, as I think our state board members will be, with the proposal that is coming forward. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
And before we wrap up, I would just like to remind everyone that today's presentation was recorded, and you can view it again on demand at successnc.org. And I'll go ahead and invite you to check out successnc.org for other videos and webinars as well. And on behalf of North Carolina Community Colleges, thank you for your participation, and have a great day.